Hello and welcome. If you've chosen to listen to this talk, you don't need to waste time telling you who Calvin Robinson is, or why cancelling him happens, and why it matters. The fact of cancellation doesn't tell you very much about him, more than you know already. He's an Orthodox Christian, he's fighting the culture wars, but of course it does tell you about the people who cancelled him. And he's just been cancelled by a group of Catholic singers and their clergy. And beyond the fact that the cancellation was rude, abrupt, brusque, and within just days of filming an Easter special in the church, it exposes things about the cancellees, that is the people doing the cancelling, that invite our scrutiny. Of course, you'll know Calvin's public ministry began by being cancelled. The Right Reverend Dame Sarah Mullally, Bishop of London, who spent most of her adult working life as a nursing administrator, was so cross with Calvin as a theological student that as a coloured man he simply didn't accept the leftish trope that the church was institutionally racist, that she cancelled his ordination. And of course, another layer to this particular episode was that Calvin had made a very good job of exposing the intellectual sleight of hand of progressive politics. And so he's been able to explain to his audiences how it has nothing to do with Christianity, and how nonsensical and spiritually vacuous it was, that the Church of England had bought so deeply into progressive culture. And since feminism is the launching pad for the progressive agenda, and Calvin had noticed that the moment you accept the non-Christian premise that equality, which is as impossible to define as it is to achieve, that equality would lead to relativism and relativism would undermine the absolute claims of Jesus. Well, the moment Calvin saw that, he no longer supported the ordination of women. But it was feminism that had made Dame Mullally Bishop of London, so it's no great surprise that she wanted Calvin shut up and shut down. Well, Calvin thankfully was ordained as an Anglican minister in the woke-free Church of England, a small but faithful offshoot of the Anglican Church. But what was a surprise was that a Catholic choir should have blackmailed Catholic clergy to have Calvin cancelled, shut up and shut down on the premises of a Catholic church in the heart of London. At Christmas, you may remember, Calvin presided over a celebration hosted by Brompton Oratory. It was one of the few unambiguously Christian presentations of the faith to make it onto the public media stage. The oratory was widely commended for welcoming him and making all this possible, and it reflected very well on the Catholic Church in London. So now Calvin and GB News had the agreement of the Ordinariat Church, the now Catholic ex-Anglicans, to present the good news about Jesus and the claims of his resurrection to the public on television at Easter. And if you were remotely Christian, maybe even just partially Christian, this would have thrilled you. But where you'd have a value system that put before your allegiance to Christ another preeminent allegiance, then not so much. And this is a tale, apparently, of the not so much. And so we're entitled to ask why. What is the value system? What is the alternative allegiance behind the cancelling of Calvin Robinson by the Ordinariat at their HQ at Warwick Street? Because it wasn't an allegiance to Jesus, was it? As a background to this, you probably know that Calvin's done a very good job of defending Christian marriage. It's news to some people, bamboozled by the progressive, yes, feminist and progressive secular brainwashing, that it matters to the Christian faith that marriage should be between a man and a woman for the purpose of having children. And Calvin's done a very competent job explaining why it does matter, not only to Christians, but also that it constitutes the glue that holds the whole of our society together, secular or Christian. In fact, his speech at the Oxford Union debate defending heterosexual marriage has gathered something like 500,000 views already. Of the various elements that Calvin's public reputation is made up of, this defence of heterosexuality is probably the main one. Additionally, he's been active in resisting predatory same-sex attracted paedophiles, aiming to get sexual access by reading to our children in the new drag queen hours, because obviously this new movement of same-sex attracted or minor person attracted cross-dressing men are very keen to read to children. Just read, obviously. What would give any fair-minded person they had any other agenda? And so back to the church at Warwick Street. The Easter broadcast was going to be an exciting prospect. Helpfully, the clergy had, generously, invited Calvin to speak at Warwick Street before. He was developing a welcome relationship with the Ordinariat Church, in fact. Following in the footsteps of Monsignor Michael Nazir Ali, he was invited to address the young adults at the Warwick Street Church. Well, they loved him. The visit was a great success. Their faith was innovated and informed. Who are these young adults? Well, they're a group of very competent, intelligent, well-educated, largely heterosexual Catholics who've made their home at the Ordinariat Church. They failed to detect any racism in Calvin. They liked his witness to the church. They were strengthened and blessed by it. Roll on Easter and this exciting and imaginative celebration of the faith and the resurrection of Jesus. So everything was developing swimmingly, but there was a sudden hiatus. It came, of all places, from the church choir. Complaints were made about Calvin by members of the choir. We don't know how many. It's alleged that there was a possibility that if Calvin was allowed to come back to the church, they would no longer be willing to sing the praises of their Lord and their Saviour at the Mass. What is not in doubt is that the clergy were faced with a choice between their choir or Calvin's presentation of Jesus and his resurrection for GB News in hundreds of thousands of homes. And they chose the choir, and they cancelled Calvin. Why? Well, the why is as important as it is interesting. And if you're someone given to stereotyping, lamentably, you will consider perhaps that a good many of the church singers in London are, as a friend of mine so sweetly put it, not of the marrying kind. There's very much a subculture of not of the marrying kind. So we can reasonably assume that this also applies to some, at least, of the singers at Warwick Street. And that given that Calvin is known at the moment best for his repudiation of same-sex marriage, stereotyping people might wonder if non-heterosexual members of the choir found his orthodox Christian critique of their lifestyle objectionable. And that was what provoked them to give the clergy an ultimatum. The clergy, of course, as we know, gave in to the ultimatum. They backed the choir. They cancelled Calvin and GB News and Easter. Now, if the stereotypers are right and it was Calvin's representation of the Catholic teaching that homosexuality is a disordered condition in practice and that the clergy backed the choir, it would mean that the Ordinariat clergy were cancelling the Anglican Calvin for standing up for the formal teaching of the Catholic Church and its catechism. Well, that wouldn't be good. Think through the implications of that for a moment. You don't need me to explain them. So, in that case, it must be a great relief to everyone to know the choir weren't remotely upset by Calvin's presentation of Christian teaching about homosexual lifestyles. They were completely relaxed about it. Shame on the stereotypers. Hang your heads. Because what we have here, in fact, is a sophisticated group of singers who are passionately engaged in political issues. We know that because they've been reading Calvin's blogs, and they were horrified, shocked, and alarmed to discover that some time ago Calvin had written an article about racism, immigration, and, I'm afraid, Enoch Powell. Well, we've already given some thought to the judgment of Dame Bishop Mullally that coloured Calvin as a racist, and we don't think he was, and nor did the group of young adults, but the choir, in their political sophistication, side with Dame Bishop. And we know this because Dr. Jules Gomez, who's a well-known Catholic correspondent based in Rome, has just written a piece on this for his publication. And to do it, he phoned the priest at the church, Father Smith. It was he who first made it clear that Calvin's offence was in fact racism. He said, to quote, "The difficulty was caused by the Reverend Calvin Robinson's reference to the speech of Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood, which he made as recently in a blog as November." Well, Dr. Gomez found this a bit surprising. Dr. Gomez is himself a man of colour, actually one should say an intellectual journalist of colour, and so he wanted to test this hypothesis further because it's a bit odd. He asked if Calvin had spoken to the ordinary, Monsignor Newton. Calvin had. Calvin replied to Dr. Gomez, "Monsignor Newton also told me when I called him, your Enoch article isn't helping." Now, in this article, you can look it up, Calvin had carefully, painstakingly distinguished between parts of Powell's analysis he agreed with and those he didn't. So it seems then it was just the crime of mentioning Enoch Powell at all that has so profoundly discombobulated the politically aware singers. Dr. Gomez asked Father Smith, actually, how many choristers objected to Calvin Robinson's reference to Enoch Powell? And, by the way, why had the presenter's nuanced position not been considered in their criticism? And how would people anyway perceive a largely white congregation with a white parish priest and a white ordinary cancelling a deacon of mixed race heritage as a racist? Well, Father Smith's position was that he wasn't prepared even to allow the issue of homosexuality to come up in their conversation, and he replied saying he would respond only to the issue of the article about Powell. He said to reference that speech was, I think, a mistake, and that any nuance would be instantly lost in the swirl of emotions that speech still generates 53 years on. Monsignor Newton, the ordinary, took the same line with Dr. Gomez, insisting it was the reference to Enoch Powell in this blog post that caused all the offence, and he said, to quote him, "No matter how nuanced Calvin's comments might have been, on television, on Twitter, in the articles he wrote, the headline, 'Why Enoch Powell is Right,' has led to much concern at what he said." End quote. So the choir experienced much concern about Calvin's implicit, nuanced, judiciously balanced racism without reading beyond the headline. Well, let's avoid stereotyping ourselves and deal with the explanation at face value. The Ordinariat, instead of cancelling Calvin Robinson for his Catholic views on sexuality and marriage, which would be indefensible, have instead cancelled him because some of their singers found it hard to get beyond a headline, in an article which actually invited people to think further about the complexities of immigration, multiculturalism, and the serious shift in demographics involving indigenous, white and Christian community in this country. Well, at least political censorship, distasteful as it is, isn't as bad as the clergy cancelling Calvin Robinson because he was articulating Catholic ethical teaching on sexuality. That would have been bad. So that's a relief then. But there's one last lament. I'll let Calvin express it himself. After so many people on Twitter had been urging Calvin that this was the moment to convert to Catholicism, Calvin replied, in fact in a conversation to Dr. Gomez, saying, "People say to me all the time, 'Why haven't you swum the Tiber?' Well, how could I? If I was to join the Ordinariat today, and if I said something that someone who's woke didn't like, would my ordinary back me up? Or would he tell me to be quiet?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Calvin replied. He went on, "It's very disappointing, not just for me or GB News or our viewers, or the Christians in Britain. It's also disappointing because we're currently seeing the Church of England entering apostasy with heretical bishops, saying that people can bless same-sex unions. Calvin went on, people are looking for orthodoxy. They're looking at the Ordinariat as a possible solution. But if the ordinary of the Ordinariat isn't willing to stand firm in the faith, well then who's going to? He asked. Well, there is an answer to that bleak rhetorical question. Many of the rank and file priests in the Ordinariat, for a start, will. But for Calvin, one of the most articulate defenders of the faith today, the damage has been done. Someone has shot the Catholic Church, at least in the foot, and perhaps in the heart.